Ja, blickarna har riktats mot Kina då Trump mötte Xi i Sydkorea förra veckan och syftet var att pausa den pågående handelskonflikten och stabilisera relationen mellan länderna. Och med mig för att prata mer om Kinas ekonomi har jag Kelly Chen, makroekonom från DNB Carnegie. Välkommen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome, Kelly. You just arrived from China. You spent there a couple of weeks, almost a month. Could you please elaborate a bit on the international perspective, on China's current strategic course, and tell us what insights you got from visiting China recently?
So if I were to sum it up with one sentence, it's China is going to keep going fast and keep steady. And that means that the policies, the strategy that they've had about building out innovation, building out manufacturing, they're going to keep doing that. That means that for Scott Bessent, for example, who's been hoping for a great rebalancing where China moves towards consumption, that will come, but it will take a bit more time.
And how much longer do you think it's going to take?
Probably we're talking in years, because what China needs to address is, one, its very clear slowdown in the housing market, the housing prices and the impact on wealth. But two, you need to get households to save less and feel safer. That means building out the social security network, making sure that the bottom is secured. That takes years.
And about the meeting between Trump and Xi, what are the most significant implications of the recent trade truce between the U.S. and China for global markets?
I think from financial markets perspective, it really rules out a new period of bad volatility. And by that, I mean volatility that escalates the same way we've seen the last couple of weeks, but also after Liberation Day. Because what I think we've seen now is the US actually recognizing that China does have a chokehold, that it is capable of responding and retaliating in a very painful way for the US. And therefore, we've seen Trump back off. And I think we've seen a recognition that the cost will be too high.
And how do you see the truce affecting the inflationary or disinflationary pressures on both China and the world economy?
I think this is quite good, because what we've seen is the trade truce lowering the tariff rates that the U.S. imposes on Chinese goods. On average, it's now around 30 percentage points, including all the exclusions. That means that inflationary pressures in the U.S. is going to be slightly less, and disinflationary pressures in China, in Europe, and other parts of the world are going to be slightly less as well.
And does the trade truce signal a lasting shift toward more compromise and less confrontation between these two powers, or should we see it as a temporary pause?
I think it depends on what you look as short-term versus long-term. So if your long-term is a year, as some people have in the markets, you're looking for a pretty long period of stability, actually. But a year is very short when you ask any strategic thinker in China. It's a very short period of time. So what I think the Chinese and the US have agreed on now is probably around 1 year pause. It may break sometime in the middle there, but 1 year of stability or rough stability is probably what we can expect now.
And if we go back to the 5-year plan, that was the Communist Party had a meeting just a couple of weeks ago. How might the pivot to the one unified national market, how it's going to impact China's regional development, especially in poor provinces?
I think if you look at the 5-year plans, one of the recommendations that really stood out this time is precisely that, this unified national market. And I think what China is trying to replicate here is what happened in Europe. So when the different countries in the EU lowered their trade barriers, we saw a fantastic growth miracle actually happen in Poland when it integrated into the EU. I think China is trying to replicate that exact same growth trajectory in its poorer provinces.
But on the same time, can you elaborate maybe on how reducing overinvestment and streamlining industrial clusters might change the competitive landscape for Chinese companies?
So that's another thing that China is trying to do. There's been a lot of investment in achieving these innovative breakthroughs, but it's also brought with it a lot of overinvestment, overcapacity. I think what we'll see now is China really hastening the exit of the companies that don't really have right of life. They are the companies that are actually the most uncompetitive, and they're going to be really called away, if you can say it that way. That, I think, is going to leave the market in a better place, if anything. It is going to make sure that the remaining few companies that will take this market is going to be able to achieve more returns to scale, be more efficient, and actually more competitive, looking at Europe and Sweden.
At the same time, only 20% of GDP or of China's GDP consists of exports, and shouldn't they focus more on exports perhaps instead of just boosting their own, domestic demand?
Certainly, I think China is going to continue exporting, but that is not really something that they can do anything about directly, not within its own 5-year plan. What China can do is provide goods and services that are competitive, that are innovative. But really what they need to do is get domestic demand up and running. Because right now, if you think about it, consumption is an even lower share of GDP compared to what is normal in developed economies. There's a lot to be gained for China to raise that share. It's just a difficult and long winding process to get that done.
And what measures do you think they would have to take?
So what's interesting for the 5-year plan is that we've now heard that they actually concretely want to raise consumption's ratio of GDP growth. That could become a part of the key performance indicators for all the provinces, the cities, the mayors. Everyone is going to try to achieve that. Previously, it was just GDP growth for the sake of GDP growth. Now it's more consumption. What can they do? Well, long term, they can try to make people feel safer. The housing market will just have to find a bottom naturally. I don't think they're ready to reinflate that. So short term, what they can do is either get the stock markets up to make people feel a little more wealthy, or they can introduce even more subsidies. So consumption coupons for the households directly.
And what additional policy measures do you expect to see from Beijing to support the domestic demand and boost that consumption?
I think definitely we're going to be on the lookout for specific numbers. So the budget that is set aside for precisely these consumption coupons. We're also going to look at budget numbers for what they'll be putting into, for example, social welfare. So childcare, pensions, healthcare, what is going to be provided over the budget.
And how will these reforms position Chinese companies to compete internationally over the next decade?
I think if China does succeed in boosting its own market demand, where the brands have brand recognition, where they are actually best in class in some cases, that is going to provide the scale for these companies to actually become even more competitive, even more effective in production, more scope for R&D breakthroughs that are needed. And what you're left with is a industrial structure in China that is highly competitive.
Thank you, Kelly.